Not only is Castlevania Symphony of the Night a masterpiece of video game design, it's teeming with references to history, religion, literature, and folklore. This is the Annotated Symphony of the Night. Welcome back. Much like the last episode that showed the length of the castle with the marble gallery, the outer wall here will give a player a clue to the possible height of the map, but it's still neither the tallest nor deepest section of the game. This area is important from a design perspective though, not just for the area that it covers. Up to this point, the locations in the game that Alucard has traveled have extra exits that I skipped, but only because Alucard couldn't access them without acquiring certain key items. The outer wall, though, leads out to zones that players may not be able to fully map, but will show them that the game is beginning to branch and become non-linear. Aesthetically, this area is the only one with multiple weather effects, which is a little odd considering we'll see other places in our travels that can look outside of the castle. Symphony's original co-director, Toru Hagihara, personally programmed fog and rain and made sure that they occurred randomly whenever you enter the area. This is according to the game's other co-director, Koji Igarashi, in the Double Fine Devs Play video. Okay, on with the game. Inside this space is a gem, which in this version of the game can only be sold to the librarian for some extra cash, though a player can equip them in Alucard's accessory slots if desired to no effect. They have various degrees of rarity, making them more or less valuable, and a handful of enemies drop them rarely. I'll bring them up again a little down the road. We have two choices, but let's go down the wall first. This is the Armor Lord, whom we may as well refer to as a sub-boss this early in the game because he's no joke. Sure, the Holy Water sub-weapon or even the Vibhuti would certainly make this fight easier, but since we gave him up a little bit earlier, we'll have to go toe-to-toe with it. It originally appeared in Rondo of Blood carrying a physical shield, but it can summon a reasonable facsimile here. It appears in future games in the series as the Great Armor, which is its name in Symphony's Japanese release. It drops the Rapier, which has a multi-stab attack with a fireball motion, and the Saber. Both of these would be nice upgrades at this point, but you'd have to be hilariously lucky to get them to drop, because this particular Armor Lord doesn't respawn upon leaving and re-entering the room after killed, making this encounter fairly unique in the game. Which begs the question of what it might be guarding. At first and even second glance, it feels anticlimactic to come into an empty room, or even get a chunk of hit point refilling meat hidden in a wall, but in just a little bit, Alucard will find the real reward. After about 25 seconds, we can obtain the Jewel Knuckles and the Miracuias quite early in the game. The Jewel Knuckles themselves greatly enhance Alucard's physical attack, and the Miracuias will give a nice little boost to his defense. The real prize is in the Miracuias' other ability, which renders Alucard immune to stone status. Honestly, while the purpose of this series is to show you everything that the game has to offer, it feels a little disingenuous to overpower ourselves this early on. So, while there's absolutely nothing, quote, wrong with using this stuff, it's mid-game gear, so let's just keep it that way. Normally, you wouldn't be able to access this room until much later after finding the Form of Mist relic, which this handy tooltip hints at. We'll have to go back the way we came, thankfully with no more Armor Lord to deal with. A little further down the road and we find ourselves besieged by blue Medusa Heads. These are pests from all the way back to the first game in the franchise, and are worth briefly talking about. Video game critics like Jeremy Parish have often cited the early NES Castlevania game's design as instructive and important because they were built specifically around the limitations of the player protagonist. Since Simon and Trevor Belmont from the early games were very methodical with both their movement and attack speed, the levels of those games were expertly crafted around them, as well as their jumping heights and distances. The Medusa Heads, then, were the perfect, most elegant foil for the Belmonts, and their clay feet nature. They fly in a movement pattern known as a sine wave, which repeats indefinitely until the enemy is off-screen. And like their appearances in other games, they have the novel ability to pass through all of the solid objects in the game until their journey to the other side of the screen concludes. Generally, they've all been weak one-hit kills in every game, but their physical strength wasn't so much their calling card as their abundant presence and knack for knocking protagonists off of ledges for quick, often cheap deaths. In fact, Igarashi mentioned in both the Old Strategy Guide interview recently translated by Shmupulations and his GDC talk in 2014 that they purposely removed falling into pits and dying from Symphony as something of a design tenet because the difficulty that came with them would intimidate new players. The byproduct of that change in design philosophy, at least in this encounter with the Medusa Heads, might rob them of their terror or annoyance that they might induce from a player familiar with the older games, but they're just as irritating for their continued never-ending spawning, and for some of the more complicated things that we'll have to do around them in a future video. An article originally found on Kotaku Australia by game designer Hamish Todd goes into great depth about the subtly complex beauty of not only the sine wave, but also the Medusa Heads' askew appearance and bloodlines for the Sega Genesis. It's worth further reading and linked below. For now, they drop the Resist Stone consumable and the Medusa Shield, which, for an enemy that indefinitely responds, is a super rare drop. Equipping it not only gives Alucard resistance to stone, but it can be used to ram into enemies, and if they're not immune to it, stone them in return. There's a lot to talk about in this curious room. First, Igarashi states in the Double Fine Devs Play video that this vase was originally going to have flowers that bloom and grow out of it as the game moves forward, but they dropped this idea. Next, you'll see a bird flying below us outside of the castle. This is actually a totally unique sprite and is not found anywhere else in the game. It'll lay eggs in the nest and will eventually hatch them. Finally, we have this telescope on the left side of the room that can look out onto the lake surrounding the castle. This early on in the game, we'll see the boatman making his way across it, which spawned a myth about the game for years that looking into the telescope was necessary to trigger Alucard's meeting with him later on. The Devs Play video put the kibosh on that though, when Igarashi himself debunked it. So, with no enemies in the room, no items to collect, and a few morsels of trivia that affects literally nothing other than the need to map it, this is probably the most fascinatingly useless room in the game. Time to go. These guys are the next level up from the Axe Knight we met earlier, but the shields they carry are really just for show. However, they drop the Axe Lord shield, which is a pretty good upgrade from the leather shield we're still packing. They also drop the Axe subweapon. There's a nice bit of visual storytelling happening in this room. From what we can see, both the door that we came in from and the bars partitioning off the next room have been blown open. And we have a hung person in a corner next to the only pieces of furniture found in this whole section of the castle. Now the question is if this person was attacked and hung, or if they've hung themselves. Were they watching over something in the next room, or did they create it? We don't really know. The Doppelganger is what the next room holds. He's an exact recreation of Alucard, but at experience level 10, as the name implies. He can unleash a few moves that we don't have this early in the game though, and this is a design trick to make the player wonder how they might obtain them, or maybe just look forward to that point. Specifically, he can turn into a bat and use the Wing Smash move, or shift into the form of mist if he's really in trouble, but this seems to be sort of rare. Doppelganger boss enemies became an on-again, off-again motif in the series, and originally started as a late-game boss in Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse for the NES. Our reward for killing him is the gladius, which is a hiltless sword used by ancient Romans. It's also the name, albeit mistranslated, of another Konami franchise that we'll see referenced a few more times as the game goes on. Here's another old-time favorite enemy from Rondo of Blood named the Skeleton Ape. He's certainly the skeleton of a primate, maybe like a giant gorilla, and tosses flaming barrels at us. Sound familiar? He drops a bunch of bananas and a stick of dynamite. This spear guard, also from Rondo of Blood, is a pretty versatile attacker because he'll poke you if you're above him or below him. His in-game description reads that he attacks with a naginata, which is a Japanese halberd. It will drop a javelin used for throwing and an iron cuirass. This is the Bone Archer, which will shoot 2 arrows before reloading. It drops a magic missile, which is a standard single-use projectile originally from Dungeons & Dragons, and a $400 money bag, giving this enemy kind of a Robin Hood vibe. The Bone Musket enemies are really great. Igarashi mentions in the Devs Play video that they were programmed to attack specifically in a 3-man flintlock rifle rotation. One shoots, then backs away to reload as another steps up to fire. All of it happens in perfect synchronicity. This was inspired by the way that Japanese warlord Oda Nobunaga trained his rifle companies. They drop a magic missile and a talisman. The talisman is interesting because it can randomly absorb damage taken based on your luck stat. The higher the luck, the more likely it is to soak up the punishment. This is the only game in the series that names this enemy the Sword Lord, as it's called the Victory Armor in Rondo of Blood, and eventually Harmony of Dissonance. We'll actually find something of an evolved version of this guy in the Clock Tower, but that's jumping ahead a little bit. This is another instance of anticlimax though, because he's kind of a strong enemy, but not really defending anything other than a $100 money bag. Anyway, he drops a cutlass, which is commonly thought of as a naval weapon for close-quarter combat when ships were being boarded. It's still equipped to some sailors as a ceremonial thing even today. He also drops the Bikitoa, though it's better known as the Bakakwa, which is a small double-edged sword from Zimbabwe. Both of these are nice upgrades to what we have at the moment if you want to farm this guy to get them, but we can score them in other ways later on. I'm sure you couldn't miss our friends the Medusa Heads as we head up. The yellow one will inflict you with stone status, making the Mirror Cuirass we picked up a little earlier look pretty attractive right about now. Other than stone, the yellow ones are practically identical to the blues. And here we have our first shape-shifting relic, the Soul of Wolf. With it, we can run through the castle at a higher speed than Alucard's slower, though certainly majestic walk. It further upgrades with other relics we'll find later too, which makes attacking and passing through enemies easier. Igarashi mentioned in the Devs Play video that the form of wolf was put into the game specifically to make castle navigation faster, not foreseeing that speedrunners would figure out the shield slide. This relic, along with its counterparts, the form of mist and soul of bat, are references to Bram Stoker's Dracula. In it, the Count shape-shifted into these 3 forms periodically, which is something that film versions usually cut down to transforming into a bat. This isn't the first time the series calls back to the book. Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, for example, had a non-Belmont protagonist named Jonathan, whom was the son of Quincy Morris from the novel. Getting back to the actual form of wolf, double-tapping the controller will let him run, which bestows a farther jumping distance. It can also help you high jump by pressing down and up on the D-pad and hitting jump, not unlike the flash kick motion from the Street Fighter games. Lastly, it's the only form that can travel underwater, which will be useful closer to the end of the game. Now that we're at the top of the wall, it's time for our last bit of trivia for this video, and it's a fun one. In the Devs Play video, Igarashi mentions that since Alucard is Dracula's son, he must have lived in the castle at one point in his life, so they were going to put in a sort of Alucard bedroom into the outer wall. Inside would have been a skeleton butler that would help you decorate the room with objects that you would find strewn about the castle. It got pulled from the game and was replaced with this save room, which we may as well use, but no good idea gets tossed out for good. Igarashi circled back to the idea for Harmony of Dissonance for the Game Boy Advance, which is the next game in the series he helmed after Symphony. Lots of fun trivia in this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. We're moving on to the long library next time, which is one of the few completely contained areas in the game. See you then.